My name is Andrew Leon Hanna, and I'm the author of 25 Million Sparks. I'm also a Knight Hennessy Scholar at Stanford University and the co-founder and CEO of DreamX America. "25 Million Sparks" is the story of refugee entrepreneurs in communities, cities, and camps all around the world. And it starts and is rooted in the Za'atari refugee camp in Jordan, which is a camp of about 80,000 Syrian refugees who fled the war that is now about 10 years old in Syria. And it focuses in particular on the stories of three some of the most inspiring people I've ever met in my life, Yasmina, Esma, and Melek, who are three entrepreneurs that I can share a bit more about. And then it zooms out of the camp and into cities and towns, about 20 or so, all across the world, where refugees, as entrepreneurs and as citizens and just as people who are in the community, are making a huge difference in the community and creating joy and dignity through entrepreneurship, through social and spiritual life, and through many other things. But more importantly, the main message of the book is that refugees, just like everybody else, are equal human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, just for who they are, even independent of their contributions. And so it's meant to tell that story through the lens of entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is often a very beautiful way in which people can use their power and skills and show kind of their personality and build a new home, even when their original home was uprooted. I think that the inspiration was in part just the belief that all human beings are powerful, beautiful, and creative people and deserve to be treated and portrayed with dignity. And the belief that so much of the divisions that we see and that we feel are in large part because we don't have a human story to relate to about, in this case, refugees, but often about other kinds of groups that we may not run into, or some folks may not run into, or have experience with. And so it's too easy to otherize. It's too easy to, in the absence of having a human story, listen to the media, the politicians, and other kind of loud voices that tell you what to believe. And so in particular about refugees, my parents were born and raised in Egypt. They're not refugees. They're immigrants that came from Egypt. The difference being immigrants choose to leave, where refugees are fleeing due to war, violence, natural disaster. But similar in the sense that, when I was beginning to write the book, I was seeing in the media a lot of talk about immigrants and especially about refugees. But often I found the narrative was one of two things. It was either refugees are victims or refugees are villains. And immigrants more broadly are victims or villains, but I think especially refugees. And having seen my parents' story as immigrants and having seen immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs all across the country through my work during the pandemic, helping them secure zero interest loans, it couldn't be farther from the truth, that kind of one-dimensional narrative. In reality, immigrants and refugees are driving incredible economic impact. Refugees, the U.S. government found, contributed 63 billion in net fiscal impact in the U.S. over a 10-year period ending in 2014. That's above and beyond any kind of initial investment. 1.5 to 2x as entrepreneurial. So that's economic. They're reviving cities that are dwindling due to, for example, Utica, New York, due to factory closures. A lot of people were leaving. Refugees from 40 countries helped revive it. So many stories what we've seen recently with the pandemic of refugees being integral parts of their communities. And then, as I mentioned before, critically, the point that even independent of those contributions, refugees deserve to be portrayed and treated with equal dignity just for being who they are. So I wanted to turn a little bit of the narrative that I had heard on its head and say, actually, these are some of the most admirable, inspiring, resilient, certainly, people, and also innovative, as we see with the entrepreneurship phenomenon. But then also to sort of make sure that folks felt connected in some way, and that's why a lot of the writing is meant to highlight the voices of folks who are refugee entrepreneurs. The three people who are the main narrative focus of the story are Melek, Esma, and Yasmina. And they're three women who live in the Za'atari camp and fled the war in Syria in the early parts of the war. And all three of them have incredible stories, and all three of them are incredibly inspiring. And they all also illustrate broader points about refugee entrepreneurship. So Esma is a social entrepreneur, author, poet, and storyteller in the camp, and she fled from Daraa, Syria, and which is in the southern part of Syria, and she dealt with a lot of difficulty in the early parts of her time after fleeing, including the miscarriage of her child. And she talks about harnessing some of the moments of darkness and kind of harnessing the spirit within her and her kind of faith for the future and her hope for the future to turn that darkness into some kind of a spark to help support the children in the camp. So she's always loved teaching. She's always loved education in general in school. And so what she does in the camp is she has a storytelling initiative that in the early days, she would literally chase kids around the camp to try to convince them to come to her trailer to listen to a story. And she would start basically a community library where she'd give folks books to kids and ask them to bring it back. And then, now after doing that for a while, and after kind of, as any entrepreneur, kind of, trying to get the customers any way she can in this case, it's an amazing storytelling initiative that brings dozens of children to the trailer very frequently. So many kids are involved, and essentially what she does is she'll tell children's stories that are meant to be uplifting and meant to help the children of the camp see a brighter future and see their own power and their own abilities and have more confidence in themselves, particularly because they've grown up in a world where, some of them know nothing but the camp or about, they don't know their home country. They hear a lot of words about war and violence and uncertainty. And so she talks a bit about how she has been striving to help people reorient their minds towards what they can do. And so she's an example of a broader narrative or a broader trend within refugee entrepreneurs, which is a deep desire to create a new home in their new country, which leads to a lot of energy, a lot of spark, and a lot of desire to launch something new, and a lot of empathy for their kind of customer base. And in this case, as a social entrepreneur, the people she's trying to serve. Yasmina had a wedding shop and salon back in her home, also in Daraa, and she came to Za'atari camp and eventually realized she would be there for a while, and so she sold all of her wedding jewelry in order to get the capital to get started. And she's an example of somebody who her wedding shop is incredibly beautiful in the camp. It has just colorful dresses all throughout the kind of main trailer portion, and a nice kind of serene salon in the back. And she's an example of somebody who exemplifies the kind of go all out and kind of full throttle extreme entrepreneurship that we see from refugees. So with her, it wasn't like we see in many refugee or entrepreneurs who are celebrated in the world, which is they have a backup option, but they're still celebrated for taking all these risks. For Yasmina, and for many refugee entrepreneurs, it's 100,000% commitment because they don't have any other option. And so they're going to make it work, and they have to make it work in order to provide food and support for their family. And then Melek is an artist. She's the youngest of the group, and she is an incredible artist, and she has done a lot of great work, both art that has helped serve the community and art that has kind of helped explain her feelings and thoughts and everything that's going through her head during the early days of Za'atari. And in particular, what I kind of discussed with her is she's an example of this cross-cultural advantage. So she goes to university in Jordan, and a lot of there's been a lot of studies that show that refugees and immigrants broadly have a particular proclivity to starting successful ventures because they've experienced other cultures. And so they've seen other markets, other types of products. And so there have been studies that show that for folks who have been in other countries, even tapping into that other kind of country's mindset helps you to, like, recalling memories of your cultural experience helps you to create better business ideas. And so that's another kind of advantage at play. Refugee entrepreneurs have many others advantages, and that's all something they've done despite immense barriers. So from the trauma of having to leave their home country, often having to deal with deaths of their family, to language barriers, of course, often tech barriers. Often folks have very little, if no, access to capital. So they don't have capital existing. And then there's a whole load of issues in terms of access to loans, in terms of discrimination in the lending system, in terms of lack of personal networks to get funding or even advice or support in the business. And so there's an amazing amount of obstacles, whether you're going to a city or a camp. And it's more acute. Well, it can be acute in either way, but when you talk about Za'atari, they came to the camp in the early days, and it's still a place that has immense need, and nobody should be living in a refugee camp. But especially in those early days, being able to, essentially, these folks created a community out of nothing and an economy out of nothing, with the support of course, international agencies and aid groups. But they did that, and I think it's an amazing story. And the goal is to celebrate them and the refugee entrepreneurs around the world, from Utica, New York to England and beyond, but also to highlight that it was the investment in them that led to the success. Of course, the kind of humanitarian organizations and things like that provide support, but it's the investment in those refugees that is what we need to do more of. So there were a couple principles. The main one was, how do I highlight the voice of the folks who are featured as much as possible? And that's the folks in Za'atari and the folks all around the world that I discuss. And in particular, knowing that I haven't had an experience even remotely like for example, the three folks that I feature the most, Yasmina, Malik, and Esma. My parents are from Egypt, so I feel some connection to the culture and the language in Syria. But of course, I will never know what it's like to live in a camp or to have my entire life displaced. And so what I wanted to do was make sure that their stories were told in a way that honors their voices as much as possible. And so tactically, what that meant was a lot of quotes. And so I led in the writing process with their quotes, and I tried to just sort of tell the story around that based on what they told me in our conversations, and much less of like a observer who's kind of providing my thoughts on what I'm seeing. I didn't find that to be as appropriate or even as interesting, versus amplifying their voices and the amazing stories and tragic but beautiful stories they've told me. So that was one. And then an extension of that is the kind of creative collaboration that I wanted to do a little bit of. And that was including a few pieces of Malik's art in the book. So in a few pages, you'll see some of her amazing art. And that's meant to, again, a lot of the way she communicates best in her view, although she communicates great in a lot of ways, but is through her art. And so being able to just show you this is the voice of Malik in a different form was important to me. And she really liked that part of it as well in showing her the book. And then Esma's poetry is included. So the book actually ends on a poem from Esma. So again, rather than just sort of having the three folks featured and having my narrative on it, it's as much as possible have their voices, both through their words and through some of their other kind of creative works. There were a couple kind of balances I wanted to create. The first was, I think, a big issue, and perhaps why the view of refugees can be very one-dimensional, is that we often can conflate their situations, which are tragic and situations no human being should have to deal with, and it's kind of a failure of the world kind of system, and it's a failure of refugee resettlement, which we can talk more about. That situation is dire and tragic, but the people are actually inspiring, uplifting, resilient, and full of dignity just for who they are. And so trying to make sure that there was a distinction between those two and trying to tease that out is that the system is terrible because we should have never had refugees. In an ideal world, there is no violence, there's no targeting within countries of people, there's no international violence that leads to the 27 million refugees now, even more so because of what's been occurring in Ukraine tragically over the last couple of weeks. So that situation is a system failure, but the people are inspiring and incredible people, and so trying to make sure that that distinction was made was important. And then the other distinction is, I focused on entrepreneurship in part because there is this refugee entrepreneurship phenomenon where refugees are, far more entrepreneurial than native-born citizens. It's a very common trend that refugees start businesses successfully, and understanding why and all of that. But the reason I focused on entrepreneurship is because of that phenomenon, and because it's a really beautiful way to understand people, them pursuing their creative works in a new home. It's such a beautiful way that refugees interact in their new home countries and use their talents and skills. Even Esma, Yasmina, and Melek, each of them, what they're working on is tied to something they cared about as children, and something they're passionate about. So it really helps tell their story, and it's a beautiful thing. But I also didn't want to implicitly send the message that, which I very much disagree with, that refugees are valuable because of their contributions, because that is a value they bring. But ultimately, the message I'm hoping through kind of relating with the people in the book in Za'atari and Utica and around the world is refugees are valuable because of who they are, because they're equal human beings, because they're just like me, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity and to be welcomed in times of dire need like this. And so that was another balance, and I tried to do that through not only focusing on the economic contributions. For example, Esma is a social entrepreneur, and also talking about people in the book who aren't even the entrepreneurs, but members of the family, and folks in the camp that folks in the camp and folks in Utica and other places who are not only providing economic value. We're living in the midst of the largest refugee crisis in history, global refugee crisis, in the sense that there are more refugees in the world today than ever before. There were 26.6 million kind of in the last report I saw from the UN. There's been about 1 million. It's been reported from Ukraine just in the last few days and couple of weeks, which is unbelievably tragic. And so, we're talking about over 27 million refugees around the world, and almost 50 more million internally displaced, which means they've been forced to flee their homes, but are still within their home country's boundaries. So both, and then an additional about 4 or so million asylum seekers, so folks who have fled their country, but have not yet been adjudicated as refugees. And so that's, for example, Central American migrants in the US. Many of them are in that camp. So the kind of first start of all that is refugees should not, have to exist. Nobody should have to become a refugee. The Tennessee Office for Refugees says being a refugee is a badge of honor, which is very true. And it's the opposite of an insult, was the quote that I used from them. But the fact remains that nobody should have to become a refugee in the first place, which means our world should be able to manage international conflict, and intranational conflict should be, governments should be checked to where there's not a need for people to flee their countries. Once that happens, though, the world has a system to try to make sure that refugees are resettled. And after World War II, that's the countries around the world came together to say, we want to make sure that we have a system. That's the UNHCR was born, but it has failed. There's a shocking figure, which is 0.2% of all refugees in the world are formally resettled, which means the vast, vast majority of refugees are in transitory, kind of unfair, unjust lives. And so they're in camps or they're in host cities, which means they're kind of temporarily allowed to live in the place, but not permanently allowed to do so. And so a lot of, for example, Syrians are in the Za'atari camp. A lot of them are in host cities in Jordan and Lebanon, Turkey, and Egypt, other places. So that's a lack of commitment from countries around the world to resettle refugees, which is a fundamental issue. The U.S. has tended to be a leader in that. During the last few years, is completely kind of flagged in that commitment. Hopefully that will go back up. But really, only 30 nations are participating in the program. It needs to be more participants and more commitments dramatically in order to kind of handle this. Again, the poet Warsan Shir says, "No one chooses refugee camps. It was of nobody's choice." And so it's a broader failure, and it's kind of countries around the world commitment should be to welcome them. And that was kind of the understanding after World War II that we have not sort of lived up to. And then the other issue is that for those folks who are in temporary places, which is most refugees, 85% of them are in lower income countries. And so, taking Syria, for example, the 5 countries that have the most Syrian refugees who have fled their countries, 4 of them are not high income. And so that adds other burdens. And so, when their countries are already working hard to make sure that their own community is provided with economic and social opportunity, it makes it even harder when other countries, when other folks are coming in. And so it turns into just a very difficult overall situation when higher income, more developed countries are not, playing their role. And then, there's the other issue of folks in temporary, host cities not having work permits. There's a host of other issues that come into play. Discrimination in hiring, not accounting for refugees' unique skills. There's again lack of access to capital, lack of access to educational resources, language, training, a lot of other things that needs to be done. And so that's when somebody's formally resettled or when they're temporarily in the place. And so in the U.S., for example, we have resettlement agencies. NPR called 2017 kind of the year that, I forget the exact way they put it, but refugee resettlement agencies kind of were gutted because the investment in that went down dramatically by the Trump administration, and that still needs to go way back up under the current Biden administration and future administrations. These are the people on the front lines who provide support for refugees. And again, as we talked about, just from a pure economic point of view, that small investment of helping a refugee get housing, get language training, tech training, it pays huge dividends. Talk about the story of some people in Utica who, lived in a church steeple early on when they arrived, and but for kind of the grace of community members, they wouldn't have had support, and that's not how it should be. When a refugee comes to the U.S., they should have a clear system of getting support. And then the other kind of issue, I think, is just a lack of storytelling about refugees humane. And so I think that contributes to the lack of investment in refugees, is a belief that they are, not the powerful, resilient, creative assets to a community that they are. And so the more we can turn that on its head, the more there will be investment in refugees' ideas. And so that kind of leads to what we can do. I think at a policy level, it's advocating that we welcome more and more refugees around the world, from around the world. And they can create beautiful communities like in Utica, where there's 40 people from 40 different countries. In Houston, where after Hurricane Harvey, it was the Afghan Cultural Center that was, helping firemen and women ensure that everyone was getting what they needed. That we can have more moments of this intercultural beauty, and more importantly, that we're doing our moral duty to provide support for folks who will then support us in many ways. So that's advocacy. And then more broadly, investment in refugees, businesses, ideas. So many of these companies that we talk about in the book started with very little money. So in the Shirkoli camp, somebody named Masika that the UN wrote about, I think it was a $70 loan to start this bread baking cooperative that made a huge difference in the camp. Razan is a well-known Syrian refugee in the UK who started a halloumi cheese company with a $2,500 £2,500 government grant, and now has employed many people. It's an amazing company. Esma only just got some books from an NGO, and that's what started her storytelling initiative. So there's so many examples where it's just a little bit of investment, a little bit of an incubator of support can provide refugees with everything they need. And just from my experience in the US, working with immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs during the pandemic, getting them $5,000 to $15,000 zero interest loans, that can go so far in terms of what they're able to do because of their resilience, their creativity, their honesty and integrity in repaying, their going all out, and their intercultural experiences. All of that contributes to that. And so, on a more personal level, there's, your faith community, if you have one, your workplace, do everything you can to welcome refugees, the Afghan refugees that may be in your community, the Ukrainian refugees that may be coming, and the many others that are already there. Usually there's a YMCA immigrant welcoming center, there's a refugee resettlement center that you can volunteer with or contribute to. In the workplace more broadly, one reason that's less about refugees and more about the system that refugees are more entrepreneurial is that there's discrimination in the employment process. So if you work for a company, talk about what is a way to be more inclusive to refugees and recognize their different abilities and their different credentials, and not either actively or passively discriminate. And then I think even just on a personal level, finding a way to reach out to refugees, whether it be at your faith place of worship or one of these local centers, and being a person who provides yourself as a resource. I think just having somebody welcome. Most refugees are so desiring of finding a new home that they would find that to be a huge difference, and even your ability to connect them to networks would be a big deal because they often don't know a single person. 25 million sparks is most fundamentally for everyone. I think the ultimate goal is to tell a story of equal dignity and to tell of the power of beauty and creativity of refugees all around the world, so that hopefully people can get greater mutual understanding and see refugees for who they are, which is people just like us who dealt with an unbelievably difficult experience that has continuing remnants, but have done so with grace and with resilience and faith. It's also, I think, for policymakers in case often there is a tension point where people in policy, immigration becomes a flashpoint. Often there's an argument about which immigrants should we welcome, which should we not. I think hopefully they will see this and either through the regular readers who are not policymakers or themselves, and see the fact that from a pure cost-benefit analysis side, refugees of all backgrounds, of all education levels, it is an incredibly powerful investment to bring them to your country and to welcome them in for their entrepreneurial reasons, for many other reasons that they contribute. But then also see the more important moral aspect of this is a crisis that everybody in humanity should be taking upon themselves to change. And as policymakers, you have a special role. And the fact that 0.2% of refugees around the world are resettled is an absolute failure, and a moral failure as well. And I think also, people who are employers, people who are entrepreneurs themselves, I think there's a lot for entrepreneurs to learn about the ways in which refugees become entrepreneurs, the way in which they find new ideas, the way in which they kind of bootstrap their ideas. I think there's a lot to learn from that. Again, we often celebrate entrepreneurs who, have, a lot to lean on if the entrepreneurship doesn't work. I think in this case, that's not true. And so I think they're in many ways more inspiring than a lot of the entrepreneurs who are celebrated in the media. So there's a lot to learn there. And as far as employers, there's a lot to think about in terms of improving your hiring system to ensure that refugees are treated fairly and that they're welcomed in as an asset to your company. And then also faith communities. So my background is I'm a Christian, and I think there's some beautiful kind of interfaith elements in the book. But I think I use a quote from the Apostle Paul about welcoming strangers, and in doing so, some have welcomed angels unaware, is the quote, and the verse. And I think it's really important to remind folks from different faith communities that this is, again, a moral issue. This is an issue of, do you see others as equal to you, and how are you going to help those who need a home? So I think that's important as well. I think, for me, the most powerful story is one of maybe the most kind of quiet. I think one of the beautiful things about the book is that it takes people from place to place, kind of a tour around the world. Za'atari camp is the base, but Utica, Houston, Yorkshire, Australia, Port Adelaide in Australia, all kinds of places in the world. The Kakuma camp, the Ritsona camp in Greece, all kinds of places. And it shows the kind of beauty that refugees bring. But I think one thing that's interesting is all of the stories tend to be more quiet. So it's not the kind of viral headlines. It's not things you hear about. And so for me, being able to meet Esma and tell the story of her doing one of her storytelling sessions. So she's sitting there in her trailer, the dark brown carpet, the kind of dark brown cushions, the flowers on the wall. The kids kind of tumble in and sit in a semicircle, and Esma is kind of doing this beautiful storytelling where her voice goes up and down, and she's showing the book to everybody, and the kids are kind of locked in. It's this kind of magical ambiance and magical experience for the children, who are so grateful for Esma and are clearly have such a fondness for her. And she has such a big heart that you can see in the way she does the storytelling. So I think it's moments like that that I hope people remember. The kind of quiet moments there are a bit of a contrast to our media kind of in political environment today, especially around this topic. I think the main takeaway is simply that refugees are powerful, beautiful, creative, inspiring people who deserve to be treated and portrayed with equal dignity, and that they provide immense value to their host or resettled communities, but that even aside from that economic, social, spiritual value, that just for who they are, they deserve to be honored, respected, and loved.